You can be the smartest person in the boardroom and still have zero impact. That line from today's guest says everything about why this conversation matters. Welcome back to the Mike Method. I'm your host, Mike Desjardins. And today I'm joined by Elizabeth Watson, the founder and CEO of Watson Board Advisors and one of Canada's most respected voices in governance. Liz brings 35 years as a lawyer, over 20 years advising boards and CEOs, and she served on boards ranging from Peterson to Shad to the Institute of Corporate Directors. She's also been named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women. In today's episode, Liz breaks down what actually separates good directors from great ones: strategic perspective, courage, emotional intelligence, curiosity, and adaptability. We talk about why nice culture quietly kills board effectiveness, how radical candor creates real value, and the difference between ideological conflict that strengthens decisions and interpersonal conflict that derails them. We'll also get into the chair-CEO relationship, where the line between governments and management really sits, and how boards can contribute meaningfully to strategy, especially in a world shaped by disruption, downturns, and now AI. If you're a CEO, an aspiring director, or already in the boardroom, this is a blueprint for what great governance looks like today. Let's dive in. Liz, I really appreciate you making time to be on the podcast today.
Great to be here, Mike. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time, and I feel like this podcast is a long time in coming. As people would have heard on the introduction, you are one of the most impressive people in the space of boards and advisory boards and have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. I also know that you and your team have done a lot of research on figuring out what makes great board members. And I'd love that to be our sort of starting off place for our conversation today. What did you learn through doing that research?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've been working in this field for over 20 years now. And when I started, skills matrices were just coming into play. And these are the templates that say, what do we need on the board? And we need someone with governance experience, executive experience, et cetera. And people really focus on the skills and the background. But over the last 20 years, we do a lot of peer evaluation for director effectiveness. So not just peer, but also feedback from management teams. We're in the really honorable position of being in the boardrooms of some of the country's largest boards and some of the most interesting boards, and also facilitating a process where we're getting feedback on each individual director and what makes them valuable to the board, what makes them valuable to management. And we decided a couple of years ago that we wanted to capture that information so that we could give better feedback to directors and understand more what those differences were. And when we did that, and we worked with an industrial psychologist as well, and when we took all the information that we had from our work and then we combined it with insight from an industrial psychologist, we came up with these competencies that we think differentiate good directors from great directors. And on every board, you will always find there's a few directors that everybody said, they're really great. They're the ones that always somehow shift the conversation, come up with the aha moment, help everyone get unstuck when they're stuck. And so we're like, what is that? And when we looked at it, it actually is not the skills. It's not whether you have an MBA from Harvard. It's not whether you've run a company from this big to that big. It's more around what sometimes people used to call the soft skills, but it's more the personal competencies, the personal attributes, the characteristics that enable them to have impact. And I've had occasions in sometimes and with boards where a director is not being that constructive and had to say to that director, you are really smart, you've got a lot of things to say, but you're actually having no impact in this boardroom, and management doesn't even want to listen to you. And because when you start talking, they don't want to listen, and they're defensive and they're mad. And so the fact is, you can be the smartest person in the room, but if you can't have impact, you're really not making a contribution. And what I do know is that directors who join boards want to have impact. That's why they do it. They want to add value. So when we looked at these differentiators, for sure, strategic perspective, system-wide strategist, someone who can see the big picture, see how those issues arising in a conversation fit in with the larger perspective for the company, number one. Number two, I think, is courage. And, I wrote a small article about this a couple of years ago because we're doing a lot of work with public companies, and a lot of the feedback coming back was that the board members were reluctant to disagree with other board members. And this is, I think, unfortunately, uniquely Canadian. We are nice. We're known to be nice. And what happens is when someone says something in a boardroom, sometimes the other directors are reluctant to actually challenge that. And of course, that's not the whole idea of having a board. You want those different perspectives. So courage is important, willing to challenge the status quo. And you need to have, a safe space to be able to do that and all of that. That usually always has to be combined with emotional intelligence, because courage, so you can blurt things out. That's the director that I just talked about that can blurt things out, but nobody wants to listen anymore. So there was a director in town, Dale Parker, and he always, I think people used to describe him as having sort of a velvet hammer. He could deliver the toughest news in the softest way and
Yeah.
have impact and get the point across in a way that people actually wanted to listen, they wanted to hear, and they wanted to do something. So courage and emotional intelligence often go together. Curiosity is another very important one. So, why does it work like that? What is causing that problem? Why are we seeing that pattern? That kind of thing. And it sort of demonstrate that sort of information seeking perspective. That's what pulls out information that everybody can see and then gets all the juices flowing as to what might be a cause or an opportunity that arising out of that. And then I'm going to say maybe the fourth one, thoughtful contributor. This is someone who speaks when it adds value. They don't not speak and they don't speak too much, but they respond and they speak. And the last one is really, I think, adaptability, and it's the ability to navigate change, to be flexible, to respond in a way that's required at the time. Because sometimes, boards need to be courageous, make hard decisions, do that kind of thing. Other times they need to be reflective and be supportive of the management team and, be aware how they're feeling. So when you take those kinds of attributes and you wrap them up in a director, these are the people that are typically seen to be the highest performers on a board.
This is fascinating because it dovetails right into the work that we've done looking at what makes great leaders. There's a concept called radical candor, and there's a
Right.
book written about it as well. And there's two things you need to do to be with radical candor. It really ties in well to courage. So one is you need to care deeply. And as you've said, most people get on boards. The care deeply thing is not the issue. The
Yeah,
issue is they care deeply and they're too nice. What nice gets replaced with in the radical candor model is challenge directly. And so if you're care deeply and you challenge directly, that's radical candor. And I think both in leaders and as I hear you saying with board members, that approach is what the kind of courage is that you're looking for in effective board members.
that's right. Sometimes boards, or many times, I think boards would benefit by talking about what is the culture we want at this board. And so you can get a lot of high powered and very successful executives, put them around the table in a boardroom, and they may or may not be able to get the best out of each other and get the best out of the group because they're not exercising radical candor for whatever reason. And so when they sit down and have a conversation about what is the culture that we want in this room, and you bring up these kinds of concepts and you say, well, what does it mean? What does good look like? What does bad look like? And people will give examples. Oh, remember when you said this, or remember when you said that, and that could be positive or negative. You start to build a culture that the candor is welcome, and these are small things that happen in boardrooms. I remember on one of the boards that I was on, everybody was marching down, option A, and we'd been going down that option for quite a while. And a director piped up and he said, I just don't agree with option A, and I think it's a bad idea. Now, he didn't carry the day, but what the chair of the board did at that time was say, thank you, Henry, for saying that, because we need to hear it, we need to consider it. And so the chair plays a big role in the culture of a board and being able to draw information out from directors, but also to create that culture of psychological safety. I mean, it's a big factor. As I said, even when there's a group of people who are highly successful, they may or may not feel courageous sitting around a group with a number of other highly successful executives.
I'd like to talk about the chair a little bit more in a minute here. I want to go back to something you said earlier around emotional intelligence and adaptability. I think when we look at emotional intelligence and we think of it as, self-awareness, so my ability to understand myself and my emotions and how I'm feeling in the moment. Empathy, my ability to understand what's going on with others and to see how the impact of my words is landing. As you said, there's some people that are really smart, and they've got a lot to say, but they're being written off, and the way they're approaching it is causing others to become defensive. The next tenet is motivation, which is like, why are they there? Like what's actually motivating them to be there? And then the other two pieces are self-regulation. So learning how to be in the moment and to regulate my emotions as is appropriate for the situation. And then the last one is social skills. How am I able to read the room through empathy, but then appropriately use my social skills to show up in the way that is going to influence the outcome without being, a bull in a china shop, or without not speaking up, in which case I don't get an opportunity to place influence. And I think if you match that EQ, those foundations of emotional intelligence, with what's sometimes being called AQ, which is the adaptability quotient, which is your idea to adapt to new information. And sometimes I've heard it said as, I have strong beliefs, but they're loosely held.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah.
It
No,
sounds like those are the types of skills, both that AQ and the EQ, that you've seen have really led to phenomenal board members.
yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And I think it's amazing. Some people it's not an age thing, it's not an experience thing, it's really a self-reflection. It could depend how you're grown up, how you lived your professional career, or what have you. So there's a lot of different things that can influence why you behave, how you behave. But I also feel that people can learn, and feedback is such a gift, and it's something in boardrooms that is not always given. In fact, it's probably a small percentage that really invest in giving meaningful feedback to directors, and it's something that's growing, and I see it happening on all kinds of boards in different ways for different boards. But it could be a large not-for-profit that does that. We definitely have some large public companies that engage in thoughtful, reflective feedback for individuals. And then we have some that really are not interested in doing that. And it's a bit of a work in progress. But I think that for groups that want to be high performing, getting individual feedback is a very good conduit to increasing impact, increasing effectiveness. Mike, the other thing I wanted to pick up on was you mentioned motivation, and I do think I did have a client once who was an owner of a family business who wasn't that keen on independent directors, didn't think they would necessarily care when the chips were down. That has not been my experience. My experience is that when people join boards, they care. Their role may be different, advisory, fiduciary, we can talk about that later, but they do care. And what I really encourage boards always to do is to really be clear on the North Star that like, what is it they're trying to accomplish? What is the company trying to accomplish? What's the board's role in that? And what is the board's trying to accomplish? So the sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that is not only because I think it's good to have a purpose,
Right.
and we can get into that. That's a whole other conversation as well that I'm passionate about. But the fact is that when we have a common purpose and it's up in the sky as our North Star, then you and I can argue about whether option A or option B will get us closer to the North Star. Right. But it's not Liz's opinion versus Mike's opinion, because then it becomes personal. And that's when we won't, I don't want to offend you, maybe I'm going to say something stupid or what have you. But when we both have a common purpose that's bigger than each of us, then I think that creates an environment where we're more likely to put ideas on the table and challenge other ideas and look for common sense of how we should proceed.
And you're raising a really interesting concept as well, which is the conflict is actually really important in boardrooms. And what I love that you're bringing up is that there's a big difference between interpersonal conflict, where I can't hear anything you're saying because I'm frustrated with you, right? Or you're frustrated with me,
Yeah.
versus ideological conflict. So we both care a lot about this organization and we're bought into the purpose, but we believe fundamentally in different directions for the organization. That's ideological in nature. It's not about you and me. It's about the
Yeah.
belief pattern of what's right for the organization. And I think boards that say, oh, we're on a board that really doesn't have any conflict, and we just kind of like, it's great, we go to our meetings, we always agree. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't think there's enough people in the room, or the wrong people in the room, or you're too nice to each other, because if you're not in conflict, there's a massive blind spot that's probably going to occur in how you're supporting this organization.
Yeah, yeah. Too collaborative is not always healthy, but you can bring different perspectives into the room and, as you say, talk about different ways to achieve the common purpose that you're involved with. Sometimes there are individuals that have different views, different philosophies, different upbringings, different cultures, and
Mhm.
I think how you can really help a board like that or a group is to identify what are those common pieces. And so it's not just a singular purpose, but the mutual expectations that I talked about earlier about how we will talk with each other can be very helpful if there's different cultures as well.
Mhm.
Like, what is the culture of this boardroom? And maybe that's not my heritage culture of how we typically operate, but this is the permission, the opportunity, the expectation in this room. And it's great to put it on the table, and then I can aspire to that if I want to be successful in that room as well. And I've been part of creating it because my voice has been heard in, deciding how we're all going to function together.
So when you think about that culture, obviously the board chair has a lot of responsibility relative to setting the agenda, talking to board members outside of the board conversation to if there's any sort of conflict or if they need more or less from a board member.
Hmm.
It leads me to think about the relationship between, because the CEO plays a big role in that as well. It leads me to think about the relationship and how important it is between the board chair and the CEO. So I'd love for you
Yeah.
to share your wisdom around what does a great relationship look like between a board chair and a CEO?
Hmm. I mean, I think at its heart, it always has to be a professional relationship. And so, too close and buddy buddy, I think, gets you into trouble because the chair's job is to manage the board, and the board's job is to support the CEO, and the chair is often the conduit, the voice that brings that in. And so, a really healthy, supportive, trusting, respectful relationship between chair and CEO is really an essential part of creating effectiveness because the CEO is more likely to share what's going on deep in the bowels of the company that a board may not otherwise know. And the chair then can calibrate how best to discuss that with the board and how best to help the CEO. So there's a lot of interplay that happens there. At the same time, the chair can't get too close to the CEO and can't
Mm,
be or be seen to protect the CEO in a way where the board's not able to do its job. So the board needs to oversee the CEO and conduct performance reviews and things
mm,
like that. And I've definitely seen situations where the chair and the CEO are actually so close that rigor isn't there. Maybe it's around executive compensation. Rigor isn't there around setting goals, evaluating performance, helping the organization stretch to meet its targets because the relationship is too close. So I always think of it as professionally close, not personally close.
right. And so that
Yeah.
they can maintain, so that the board chair can maintain that objectivity and the board hold the CEO responsible for delivering on the
Yeah.
promises that the management team has made.
And when you are a chair, I mean, you have to manage yourself.
Yeah.
I chaired a national not-for-profit for 4 or 5 years. I really like the CEO. He is
Yeah.
doing a great job, in my opinion, still is.
Yeah.
But I wasn't his friend. I didn't go on holidays with him
Right.
or his family, that kind of thing. He gave me
Yeah.
a ride to the airport now and again, but that
Yeah.
was about
Sure.
it. But, I liked him, I respect him, etc. But I also made sure that the board did its job.
Right.
And we had in-camera meetings and we talked about the performance of the CEO. And, if there were issues to address, we gave him feedback. But we did it in a way also that he could see that we were very supportive. And I think it was a really constructive relationship. But so it was close. I like him, but I also had to do my job. So as chairs, we have to check ourselves and make sure that we're doing the job that we're supposed to do in that role.
So so we've talked about the chair of the board and the CEO and the objectivity that's required there, and the board's role relative to the CEO. I'd love to get into the conversation. The black and white and maybe the gray area of where what the board is responsible for versus what the management team is responsible for.
Yeah.
How do you maintain that governance so that you're having the right conversations in the boardroom and you're not drifting too deep into the organization, and vice versa, the opposite is happening where the management team is trying to drive the board in a direction and isn't really able to be held accountable.
Yeah. That's probably the question we get asked the most. What's the line? We call it the line. We have, templates, examples, discussion points, articles about the line that we talk to boards about. And it is a tricky issue. And the fact is, there is no bright line. In fact, often there's an old adage, noses in, fingers out.
Right.
Well, that's good to a point. But,
Yeah.
for example, I got a call one time during the pandemic from a person. They were the chair of a board. It was operating a care facility. People were dying. This person felt that the CEO was not doing a good job, but they felt restricted to look into it further, to take action that might be deep within that organization because noses in, fingers out. And I'm like, no. When you see a problem, you need to dive. And when you see something like this that is significant, and this person was, as you can imagine, incredibly distraught, feeling helpless because there's this thing out there that you can't, deep dive. So a board has to really, this is why I think you need board members that know what they're doing and know what they're looking for and have intuition, they have experience, so that when something comes forward that maybe doesn't feel quite right or doesn't align with the logic that should be there, to ask a few more questions. So I think the boards do their work by asking questions. Boards don't direct. Boards ask questions and elicit information, and through that, determine whether things are running well, not running well, whether the CEO and team are doing what they should be doing in the circumstance. Their job is not to go in and say, well, you should do this and you should do that. And so when there's a problem, the board dives and think there's a safety issue happens. You've got a mining company and there's an bad accident. Do you think you sit back and just say, well, let's talk about the strategy of how we deal with safety? No, you want to know what happened, what went wrong, what was the report, those kinds of things. But then you rise back up again. So predominantly we're thinking about long-term strategy, long-term risk, leadership succession, those kinds of things. But when issues are in front of you, and particularly when there's problems, you do need to investigate. So you need to be aware and be curious. This is where curiosity comes into it. The line is another area where I think a conversation between the board and management can be very helpful, because it is an area that we get a lot when we do a lot of board evaluations. How are things working? Management will say the board is in the weeds.
Right.
But too much in the weeds. Well, what is that about? Well, sometimes it can be bad. Sometimes board members are phoning people down within the depths of the organization, A, asking them what's happening on a particular project, and B, making some suggestions as to what they should do. That's not the board's role, because the board is operating at a much higher level. And so that is bad behavior, and that shouldn't be allowed. When the board as a whole is concerned about something, it does need to, I believe that the board has to do what it does to make sure that the company, the integrity, the ethics, legal compliance, safety, all of those kinds of things are dealt with. And even, operationally is, if we're still not performing well after we've done all these things, we need to dig deeper and get to the bottom of it and understand. When it comes to sharing information and how directors have impact, I do think that management doesn't want to hear you should do this, you should do that, you should do the other. What they want ideally is to hear from somebody who's been there, done that, and can say, offer up, when I did this is what happened, this what went well, this what didn't go well, and here's some things that you might consider. So it's a different tone than, so the line also gets crossed when you have individual directors saying, you should do this, you should do that. And that can also get very confusing for management if the chair doesn't, bring clarity. What is the board saying here? Are they telling us to do something? It's one director says something. So this is part of creating, order in the boardroom and clarity, that you can speak with one voice and management is clear when they leave the room. what the board has decided and what action needs to be taken, that kind of thing. So it's managing a whole group of people, and it can be tricky at times.
You brought up another thought that came up for me, which is in the work we do around strategic planning, our facilitators have run into situations around the line. Where does the line relative to strategic planning? Does that management's responsibility to build the strategic plan and the board's responsibility to hold them accountable for achieving it?
Mm.
What do you see and maybe there's no best case scenario, on average, how do you think that should work between the board and management?
I think it's changing, Mike. I think
Yeah,
25 years ago, we would say management creates a strategy
yeah,
and the board says, does that sound reasonable? Okay, yes, I'll poke and prod at it. Oh, it's
right,
reasonable. I'm going to approve it, and off we go. I think today that management themselves and investors expect the board to weigh in on big picture strategy and big decisions they do weigh in on. But so what we are often seeing is more around strategy sessions where there is opportunity for board members to brainstorm or engage with management team members, particularly around tricky issues. And today it's it's more and more. The world is more complex. More CEOs don't feel they have all the answers because of the changing environment that we live in, that we're all quite well aware of. And so I think that there's actually more of a pull to directors to provide their opinions and insights to help management consider the big picture out there and what might be the risks and opportunities of different scenarios, different opportunities that they might pursue. So I think all hands on deck to put the brain power. And I think we've always said that, a board isn't just there for oversight and are the financial controls in place and are they accurate? There's always been two roles to a board. One is that piece of, governance, accountability, et cetera. But I think the other piece has always been the kind of, we used to call it the value add, the advisory, et cetera.
right.
And I do see a pull on that. Now, you know, if a board is overtaking management and doing all the heavy lifting, then you maybe don't have the right people on the team, or that something's out of whack there. But I see people expecting the board to contribute, especially at a high level. The other thing that I'll just say on that point in terms of how boards contribute to strategy and thinking is that, there's a piece of the board meeting that's really oversight. What happened? Is it all okay? If not, what are you doing about it? Does that sound reasonable? Okay, fine, keep me posted. There's that kind of
Right.
piece. And then there are pieces that we've been talking about making an acquisition. We've narrowed it down. We've had some meetings. We know what we're looking for. We've looked at some targets, et cetera. And now we're going to make a decision to go forward with that, a big sort of a strategic move. You make a decision. I think that boards and management teams are desiring a bit of time in the boardroom for that. Some people will call it generative. Some people will call it blue sky. It's a time when you have a little bit of quiet time to say, with the political unrest that's happening right now, does this provide an opportunity for a company to do X or Y? Good ideas can come from anywhere. And so it shouldn't be random. It should go through a bit of a filter with the chair and CEO to say, is this something that's worth talking about? But having the opportunity to talk about a topic without it being a structured, here's the material. Have you read it? What are your
Mhm.
questions? Let's debate this or that. Now we'll make a decision. I
Right.
think boards are looking for a bit more time to have those kind of conversations, at least um, to create an opportunity if there's something important. So not to force it, but to create an opportunity. And you can do this sometimes at a dinner when people have dinners, say the night before a board meeting. But you can also do it in board meetings as well.
I think you raise a really good point, because that's what we've seen as the migration is that the boards are providing their insight and their experience to help to guide and shape the strategy, still allowing the management team to come back and, build OKRs and
Well,
come
yeah,
up
yeah.
with, yeah, like build the plan. But in terms of their, in a lot of cases in the boards that I've sat on, the level of wisdom and experience, like, so for instance, they've seen, 3, 4, financial downturns in their career. And
Right,
if the
right.
CEO is new, and this is the first time with them riding through a downturn, these waves have a relatively predictable outcome. There's a time horizon to them, and there's some hard lessons that you learn by going through those downturns. That you really have to have gone through it to understand how it affects the people in your company, how it affects your competitors, where opportunity can come up, and to not tap into that when you've got experienced board members seems like it's negligent to not bring them into that strategic
Yeah.
conversation.
I think almost every board I work with has at least an annual strategic offsite with the board, with management team.
Yeah.
And, one board that we've been working with, the management team's working with an outside firm. They're doing a tremendous amount of work looking at their longer term strategy, assessing the situation. It's probably taking place over a year, and the board is being involved along the way. It might be involved at the beginning, shaping what are some things that we should be putting on our radar, that we should be thinking about. And then as those things might be explored and either rejected or pursued, those are coming back, and then there's different levels that the board is contributing to. So the board's not driving it, but the
Right.
board is engaged in the way that you talk. And I believe that is very, very common today.
Now,
Yeah.
we've been using the word board throughout this conversation, and I'd love to just differentiate between, an advisory board and a board of directors, so that for listeners, they can understand the difference in responsibility and the difference in structure. Like, could you just walk us through what is the purpose of an advisory board, and what are the types of organizations that would have that versus a board of directors, and how how the responsibilities of the boards are different, but also there's different liabilities that fall on the people that are playing roles on those boards. And I'd love if you could just differentiate those for our listeners.
Yeah, so if we start by saying, what are they? An advisory board is more of an informal group. I'll come back to that. That is typically brought together to provide, I would say, strategic advice to the CEO to help guide the CEO. Maybe it's a new CEO, could be guiding them on things internal to the company, could be around strategies. So where are these most
Family business, I'll just chime in that family businesses, particularly if they're going through intergenerational transfer, it's always a nice thing to have an advisory board to take that pressure off the matriarch or patriarch that may have been running the business.
We get a lot of requests to help family organizations create boards. And there is always a question, should it be an advisory board or a fiduciary board?
Yeah,
So the advisory board, like I said, it is advisory. It doesn't really have responsibilities.
sure.
You're going to get smart people. They're going to give you their best ideas. Off you go and use them, don't use them, do what you want. A fiduciary board is a legal board with statutory common law responsibilities to be loyal to the company and also to act with good care, reasonable care and diligence, a duty of care. So fiduciary boards are going to be interested to make sure that the company is in compliance with all of its legal and regulatory requirements, that good governance is in place, that there's clarity about who does what and how decisions are made. They're going to be weighing in on strategy, risk appetite, those kinds of things, structure, practices, etc. When a family business is going through transition, often that is a time when they look at creating a board, and I'll come back to which one they create because it's not always an advisory board first, but they create boards to bring in outside people primarily who can bring objective expertise, connections, insights to help that business. And the reason some bring in an advisory board is they want it to be less formal. They don't want to maybe put together the bells and whistles of having a formal board and reporting and that kind of thing, whereas they can still get the benefit of insight, strategic insight on strategic issues and whatever it is that the company needs. I have seen situations in family businesses in particular where advisory boards have been helpful and where they have not had impact. Where they've been helpful is where, they bring people in and they really listen to them. So the advisors are able to help them move forward, not only in the strategy for the business, but looking at the entire enterprise and understanding the kinds of structures and investments that the family should be making informalizing the processes and practices through which the whole family enterprise operates, because as it goes from generation to generation, there are owners and family members, and there's board members, and there's, executives and things like that. There needs to be order so that this can all function well. There needs to be alignment and who does what and how do decisions get made and those kinds of things. So advisory boards work well when they have a purpose and when there is some formality. When I said they're informal, they're not appointed as legal directors, so they don't have those legal responsibilities. At the same time, if you don't create some kind of formal structure, so we're going to meet, in this way, somebody chairs the meetings, this is the purpose of the advisory board, here's where we want you to weigh in, here's where we don't want you to weigh in. And there's somebody who's really helping to guide and extract value from the advisory board members, and the advisory board members can give value. That's a perfect situation. But I have seen situations where the advisory board themselves were not quite able to create enough structure to provide value, and at the same time the company, the owners and the executives weren't really interested. The owners were interested but didn't really know how to make it happen, and so they met, they kind of talked about things, but I did a review afterwards and it was really of no impact. And then they decided they wanted to put in place a fiduciary board. So we helped them put that together, and those people and that structure has really helped this particular organization. So as you know, with family businesses, every enterprise is unique, and so there are pros and cons to different approaches. But I think advisory boards, when you've got executives running the business or looking for outside expertise, but maybe they're not at the stage where they need to formalize transparency, accountability. Once businesses get into multiple generations, and if multiple generations are involved in ownership, maybe still in running the business, et cetera, and maybe there's other components, there's a foundation, there's other things, then it is often the time we see it progress. Actually, family businesses often start with an advisory board and then they transition into a fiduciary board. And over time, you can look at some of the public companies in Canada or large private companies. Over time, they actually transition to having a majority of independent directors and operate with much more formality.
So maybe let's talk about the as you speak about independent directors. Obviously, on an advisory board, there isn't the need usually to have somebody that has gone and become certified. So can we talk a little bit about the certification process to actually becoming a formal board member on a fiduciary board, and what that process looks like for somebody that is kind of getting to that stage in their career where they're considering being on a board. They maybe haven't been on boards before. They're thinking about either not-for-profit or a for-profit or a public board. They're considering advisory boards, and they've heard that there's a certification. What do they need to know about that certification?
Yeah. So learning how to be a good director and learning about your responsibilities is really important. So knowing what you're signing up for, knowing what good looks like is good. So, going through a certification program for that, and we'll come back to what those are, is a good idea. A certification program will not, you can't take a 12-day program and think you're going to be recruited to the Royal Bank of Canada, because you're not. Right. You get recruited to business boards primarily for what you have to offer that board based on your career and your knowledge, your experience, etc. Not because of a certification, but a certification does indicate that you're interested. It really teaches you the breadth of the board's role, talks about, responsibilities and how you discharge those responsibilities. And that's a really important piece to know. So I think the Institute of Corporate Directors, the ICD, has a program. There's also a program with the Directors College, it's called, which is a similar program, also very good. And then there are smaller, certifications or programs that you can attend. There's day-long programs on HR committees and strategy committees and things like that offered through the ICD. And there's actually a lot of programs around that are quite good. But the two comprehensive ones in Canada are the ICD program and the Directors College. So if you're interested in serving on in a serious board capacity, probably a good idea to check those out and see if they're right for you. If you come with a lot of understanding. You've learned about boards because you've been an executive reporting to one, or you've had occasion to serve on boards and learn by doing, not-for-profit boards, private company boards, or what have you, then maybe you may or may not benefit from taking one of those courses.
That's great. I appreciate your sharing your wisdom around that, because I get asked that question a lot from people
Yeah.
that are at that point in their career where they start to say, I think it's time for me to explore, whether it's advisory board, not for profit, or fiduciary board. And the first question I
Mm-hmm.
get asked is, I've heard I'm supposed to do an ICD. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's first of all talk about where you think you're going to go based on your background and your experience, and where you could add value,
Yeah.
and what some of the different stepping stones are. One thing, though, that I want to touch base on that you said early on in the podcast, which I really appreciate, is that the time to get on a board is not age related. Like, if you're thinking, if
Mm-hmm.
somebody's sitting here as a listener thinking, oh, I need to be in my E's and I need like 30 years of business experience before I could even thinking about being on a board. I don't think that's not been my personal experience. And I'd love to just hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think, sort of no time too early. And I think I started serving on boards probably in my 20s, and some were, they weren't significant. They weren't changing the world. I went on the Vancouver Police Board when I was probably in my late 20s or early 30s, and that was a very interesting experience, and I learned a lot. I wasn't very useful on that board until I was fortunate enough to attend some education, director education. And then I understood, okay, these are what I need to be doing. It gave me confidence. And this is what we often say, that when we talk to directors, that it's about having confidence, because directors, fiduciary board, you shape the future of the organization.
Right.
You make the big decisions. At the end of the day, the board is going to decide, are we going to put $1 million, $1 billion into this project? Are we going to fire this CEO, hire this CEO? What's our risk appetite? Are we going to expand globally or not? You do make a lot of decisions, and you want to have the confidence that you're making good decisions. So you want to think about, who's on the board with you. But I'd like to come back again to that issue of, how young is too young or how old is too old. And I had a very interesting conversation with the board chair the other day. And he said, as a result of AI, for example, do you think we should be changing up the composition of our board? And I said, yes. Now, I said that the other day in another group, and there was a fellow there, and he said, well, I disagree with you. And I was like, that's great. Let's chat about it. But my thinking is that the way business is being done today is very different than it was done maybe even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And there are those people who have been really engaged in the changes that are happening, and they really do understand how the mechanics of business and the world are operating today. And I think there are many people who do not. And so I think that the people who do not have a lot of experience in business today can still contribute to things like AI governance, like what's our approach for the company, and
Right.
privacy, and human in the loop, and all of these kinds of things. But are they going to be advisors on the strategy or the advisory side in terms of entrepreneurial, or what about this, or if management's coming with all these great ideas, are they going to be able to understand that this is a good idea and that's a bad idea and this is why? And I just don't I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly makes me wonder, because I think that the essence of business has changed. I think the face of boards needs to change. I think that there's a lot of people with a lot of varied experience. Companies will benefit from having that breadth of individuals on the board who have a lot of experience with what's going on in the world today. So I think there's huge opportunities out there.
I love what you said there about, and if I was to summarize it, I would say, if you're thinking about being on a board, you don't have to be the perfect board member that can cover every topic that the board is ever going to talk about. You may have an area of expertise that is really important to that organization. And, I can remember when social media started to pick up, you actually needed somebody relatively young on the board who understood the mechanics of social media. That might be true with AI today. And so they may not be able to bring the depth of experience in business, but they bring a unique set of knowledge that no one else on the board shares. And to be able to bring that is actually contributing a lot. And through the activity of contributing to that, you're also learning from the other board members. And I think, one of the things that's always struck me is that, and it took me a while to learn this, but now I look when I'm asked to be on whatever the type of board is, my first thing I do is I go look to see who's already on the board.
Yeah.
Because I want to know, one, am I contributing something unique? And two, can I learn something from the people on the board? And after that, then I think about the organization and think, am I passionate about this organization? Do I think I contribute to the organization? And it's interesting because I think a lot of people might consider that the first question is, well, am I passionate about what this organization is doing? And over time, I've sort of changed my perspective on that.
Well, I think you're right to think about the people on there, because one of the things I often say to people who are interested in board work is it's a very interesting profession, because it's the only situation where you can be personally liable for decisions you make as a group.
Right.
So if you don't have smart people around the table with you and you're getting drawn into making some not smart decisions, that could not be good for you. And the second thing to realize about board service is, when I talked about the director's duty of care, do a good job, what is considered a good job is dependent on what a body of experts around your jurisdiction think a board should be doing.
Right.
And so today, board experts think that boards should understand their company's culture, and they should not be allowing harassment, and they should be diving deep if they think it's happening, and getting into it and really understanding, because that's a board responsibility to make sure it's a safe place. Mm-hmm. Whereas, do you think 10 or 20 years ago anybody was saying, well, what's our culture? And we didn't have risk committees. The banks didn't have risk committees way back when. We've had boards for hundreds of years. And so the expectations change, and what you're expected to know and how you're supposed to contribute changes with the world that's happening. Cybersecurity is one of the big issues for boards. They need to know about it. So no, you're not going to come with all of this knowledge and background in all these areas, but you need to be able to learn it and to oversee it and to contribute to it. The question I had around AI is really, if you have no one on your board who's worked in the kind of environment that your company might be operating in today, and every company's different, but thinking of one that's in, retail or communications or, whatever it's in, where the world is changing quickly and there could be opportunities out there. Is it good to have someone on the board versus, have an expert come in and talk to us or review our company strategy and give us some views on whether they think it's smart or not, and I think it's worthwhile. And this will bring us to having younger people on boards, because the average age today is probably,
Liz, I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation today. I feel like we need another hour to truly get into your depth of wisdom. Thank you so much for making the time.
No, Mike, it was great to see you. Thanks for the conversation. I enjoyed it.